The axe is laid at the foot of the tree. When the first blow is struck, there will be more money to help.
One cannot fully document or understand the history of Africans or the arguments surrounding the institution of slavery in the United States without looking at the development of the American economy in the 19th century. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of Treasury during George Washington's first term, introduced federal bonds to pay off America's Revolutionary War debt. These federal bonds, which were called the stock, were essentially interest-bearing promissory notes, and they would form the basis of the fledgling securities exchange or stock market in New York City. The Bank of New York, which was co-founded by Alexander Hamilton in 1784, was one of the nation's first commercial banks. Commercial banks loaned money and issued paper currency called banknotes, which could be redeemed for their equal value in gold or silver coin. The Bank of New York financed the construction of canals and steamboats to transport free people, slaves, and precious cargo, specifically cotton, from one part of the country to the other. Cotton drove the American economy throughout the 1830s. As demand from British textile mills moved the country west in a search for farmland, planters took their slaves with them. Financiers in New York and London provided working capital for the clearing of land and funded the transfer of slaves. Slaves cultivated, harvested, and pressed the cotton into bales, then loaded the bales onto steamboats, which transported the raw material to the country's first real factories that sprouted up along the rivers and streams of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. New York City took in much of the cotton, which it shipped to London. Britain shipped back the finished fabric to Manhattan's garment district, where it was turned into clothing, sheets, and draperies. The cotton would eventually return to the South as fine goods that were then sold with high markups. This commercial trade between New York City, Europe, and the southern plantations was so lucrative, it came to be known as the Cotton Triangle.
Our fathers fought nobly for freedom, but they were not victorious. They fought for liberty, but they got slavery. The white man was benefited, but the black man was injured. I do not envy the white American the little liberty which he enjoys, but I would have all men free.
South Carolina was the richest slave state before the American Revolution and the introduction of the cotton gin. Charleston was the closest American port to the West Indian colonies, and a large number of European businessmen from London and Barbados brought their slaves with them from the rum and sugar trades. Some of the wealthiest slave owners were Jews with Portuguese or Spanish heritage, known as Sephardic Jews, and Yiddish-speaking Jews of French and German descent who migrated to South Carolina from Georgia after slavery was briefly banned there in 1741. The second wealthiest man in South Carolina was a Jewish merchant named Mordecai Cohen, who was born in Poland in 1763 and began work as a young immigrant peddler in Charleston. Cohen would eventually own several properties in the city and large plantation estates on the Ashley River. By 1800, South Carolina had the largest Jewish population in the United States, and the state's primary cash crop during this time was rice. Black slaves were imported from the rice-growing region of West Africa to cultivate, process, and package the crops on large plantations. After the male slaves cleared the mosquito-infested swampland, female slaves would pour rice seedlings onto the wet soil, then press the seedlings down into the mud with their bare feet. Large populations of West Africans lived together on these isolated plantations located in the Low Country and on the Sea Islands, where they developed their own culture and language known as Gullah. South Carolina's small population of free blacks was mostly located in Charleston. In Charleston, freedom was inextricably linked with light skin. Charleston's light-skinned brown elite mimicked the behavior and aspired to be like white slaveholding society, which created a lasting tension with dark-skinned blacks. Free Negroes in Charleston were required to wear an identification badge like other blacks in the city, but they were a working aristocracy that achieved a certain degree of economic independence. One ex-slave named William Ellison Jr. went on to become the largest black slave owner in South Carolina. Most black wealth, however, was held in real estate. White slave owners lived like English aristocrats and wielded total control over the government of the state. In addition to being snobbish, South Carolina's greedy rice planters were notoriously hard slave owners. The property that Mordecai Cohen gifted to his sons and the 1,000-acre Soldier's Retreat estate he built for himself were some of the South's largest plantations.
I have heard a great deal said about hell and the wicked places, but I don't think there's any worse hell than that sugar house. You may hear the whip and paddle there all hours in the day. There's no stopping.
A young black man named Jim wrote about the brutality he and others experienced on the Cohen plantation in the 1838 narrative, Recollections of Slavery by a Runaway Slave. Jim recalled a slave being whipped for hours by Mordecai Cohen's son until he was finally beaten unconscious, then having his body with its torn flesh dipped in salt water for stealing a few sticks of wood. Jim ran away and hid out with a maroon community deep in the swamp after receiving a vicious beating himself, but he was eventually captured and sent to Charleston's infamous city jail and workhouse, called the Sugar House, where slaves were forced to work a treadmill and were the victims of unspeakable torture at the hands of sadistic guards. South Carolina's Jewish slave owners, like its black slavers, were small in number. Most Jews abhorred slavery and were not slaveholders. Some, like the noted Louisiana abolitionist and philanthropist Judah Touro, secretly financed Underground Railroad activities. South Carolina's planters overworked the land and eventually wore out the soil in the Low Country. Close to half of South Carolina's white residents, many of them planters, moved to the Deep South or out west in search of more fertile land. Others relocated to northern cities like Baltimore and New York. Canals and steamboats cut travel time in half, which lowered shipping costs. As steam technology advanced, travel became less expensive, which made it easier for whole families to relocate. Advances in transportation also increased the flow of information and the trafficking of heretical new ideas. In 1822, a nearly 2,000-year-old Egyptian artifact called the Rosetta Stone was deciphered in Paris and sparked worldwide interest in Egyptology. A year later, Joseph Smith, a paranormal treasure hunter from Vermont, claimed he found a set of golden plates engraved with reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics in Manchester, New York. Smith's translation of these golden plates was published in 1830 as the Book of Mormon. According to Mormon doctrine, a skin of blackness was a divine curse placed upon an ancient people called the Lamanites for their wickedness and corruption. After being arrested and repeatedly threatened, Smith and his followers moved to Ohio, where a mob beat him unconscious, tarred and feathered him, then left him for dead. Smith recovered, and the Mormons moved further west. In 1831, William Miller, a Freemason turned Baptist preacher, prophesied Christ's return in 1844 and started a religious movement called Millerism, which splintered into smaller esoteric Christian sects like the Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists. The popularity of New England mesmerizer Phineas Quimby and magnetic healers like the Poughkeepsie seer Andrew Jackson Davis would lay the foundation for the New Thought spiritual movement, which was supposedly based on accumulated ancient wisdom and emphasized positive thinking. While common folk were drawn to New Age prophets, faith healers, and spiritualists, many of the most prominent members of America's financial elite, like the Judge Thomas Mellon of Pittsburgh, would eventually gravitate to the works of Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer. Darwinism confirmed the Anglo-Saxon belief that the Aryan race was superior and rationalized white acts of aggression toward darker races as natural selection. Farmers were unambitious in the view of America's new industrial elite, and military service, in the words of Judge Mellon, was best suited for men of low class, low intellect, and who would not be missed.
In a single hour, Such fabulous wealth has been destroyed.
Every shipmaster,
passenger, and sailor, and all who make their living from the sea, will stand at a distance and cry out at the sight of the smoke rising from the fire that consumes her. Woe, woe to the great city, where all who had ships on the sea were enriched by her wealth. For in a single hour, she has been destroyed.
Prominent families in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were enriched by their investments in the booming cotton market, while others, like steamship magnate Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, amassed great fortunes in transportation. Prices soared to all-time highs for land, cotton, and slaves before the bottom fell out. Advances in transportation also created a surplus of cotton at warehouses. Planters were producing cotton faster than it could be sold, which resulted in a decrease in its value. A financial crisis in 1837 triggered a depression that lasted until the mid-1840s. Overconfident Southern planters had spent too much of their money in advance. This led to the complete bankruptcy of many plantations. Bank failures in New York alone accounted for nearly $100 million. More than a third of all the banks in the United States failed and never recovered. The Panic of 1837 lasted 7 years and left thousands of Americans jobless. Lieutenant William Tecumseh Sherman was serving under the military governor of California when the first specimens of gold were unearthed at Sutter's Mill in 1848. The ensuing gold rush of 1849 would be the financial shot in the arm the country needed to recover. Within 2 years, America's struggling economy would be back on its feet and stronger than ever. But most of the northern banks and financiers that survived the economic downturn had learned from their mistake and never invested in slaves or cotton again. The discovery of gold in Northern California coincided with an influx of over 200,000 Irish immigrants fleeing a potato famine and political exile. Poor Irish families replaced enslaved Africans as the human cargo of choice at the infamous former slave port of Liverpool. Most of these Irish immigrants ended up in New York, where they were discriminated against and exploited politically. Poor Irish immigrants were herded into densely packed slums, like the Five Points Ghetto, where they formed violent street gangs that acted as muscle for the local Democratic Party machine, which controlled New York politics. Wall Street turned its attention and pocketbook west. When the first census of African Americans in California was taken in 1850, there were 962 black people counted. 10 years later, there would be more than 4,000. Runaways and free Negroes made their way out to California, hoping to find gold or work on the railroads. Black Californians, however, would not find freedom from racial tension. California was thousands of miles away from the Deep South, but a legion of miners had migrated from the tapped-out gold fields in Georgia, and countless white people arrived from the hardened pro-slavery state of Texas. A heated debate raged over whether to allow slavery in the Golden State. California's first governor, Peter Burnett, called for a complete ban on Negroes, a measure that was popular with many residents. In the end, California would be admitted as a free state, and working conditions for free Negroes were generally favorable compared to what most African Americans experienced back in the South. In a letter to his wife, an African American miner wrote that California during the gold rush years was the best place for black folks on the globe. All a man has to do is to work and he'll make money. A handful of blacks got rich mining for gold, while others performed a variety of domestic services like housekeeping and grooming. Enterprising blacks turned their cooking and laundering clientele into successful businesses. Some blacks even started towns like the Negro Hill business community, which was founded by free blacks from New England in 1848 on the banks of the American River near Sacramento. Hundreds of abolitionists from Boston, Philadelphia, and New Bedford migrated to California in 1850. Among them was a free black woman named Mary Ellen Pleasant. Pleasant was extremely secretive during her 90 years on Earth, and much of her life remains a mystery today. Some say she was born a slave on a large plantation in Louisiana or Virginia, and was rescued by a white planter who was so taken by her light skin, he purchased Mary and sent her to a New Orleans convent. According to her memoirs, Pleasant was born free at 9 Barley Street in Philadelphia on August 14, 1814. Mary Ellen's father was either Polynesian or Cherokee Indian. Her mother was rumored to be a full-blooded black voodoo priestess from Georgia. Pleasant sailed on a ship to New Orleans, where she arranged for the escape of runaway slaves, learned to cook, and was said to have taken lessons from the city's infamous voodoo queen, Marie Laveau. She left New Orleans just before the slave patrol arrived to apprehend her for her Underground Railroad activities. The voyage to California took about 4 months, but Pleasant arrived safely in San Francisco on the steamer Oregon after traveling through Panama. A self-described capitalist by profession, it was said that Mary Ellen had $15,000 in gold coins when she arrived. At that time, only 1 out of 10 new arrivals to California were women. Pleasant carved out a small fortune for herself by providing food and lodging for gold miners. She doubled her fortune in San Francisco by making shrewd investments. Mary regularly obtained inside information by eavesdropping on her wealthy white employers and customers. Mrs. Pleasant would eventually own several boarding houses, laundries, and whorehouses. But slave catchers and slaveholders also came out west looking for runaways, and there was a California law that allowed any black person to be sold into slavery if they did not have appropriate papers. Most of Mrs. Pleasant's operations were actually safe houses on the Underground Railroad. In addition to secretly funding the transportation of fugitive slaves to California and helping free or represent enslaved Negroes who accompanied their masters to the state, Pleasant financially supported John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Later, a note that was signed with the initials MEP, later attributed to her, was found in Brown's pocket when he was executed for murder and treason on December 2nd, 1859. She wrote, "The axe is laid at the foot of the tree. When the first blow is struck, there will be more money to help."
Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration were brave men. They were great men, too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. They loved their country better than their own private interests, and though this is not the highest form of human excellence, all will concede that it is a rare virtue, and that when it is exhibited, it ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man whom it is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. In their admiration of liberty, they lost sight of all other interests. They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but that they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times. How circumspect, exact, and proportionate were all their movements. How unlike the politicians of an hour. Their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in strength into the distant future. They seized upon eternal principles and set a glorious example in their defense. Mark them. Mark them.
Money, as novelist William Dean Howells would later write, was the poetry of the age. The gold rush period of antebellum America was filled with high adventure and limitless career opportunities for young, energetic white men like Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie arrived in the United States from Dunfermline, Ireland in 1848 and got his first job in one of Allegheny City's 5 cotton mills. Nearby Pittsburgh, which was dominated by iron foundries, rolling mills, and glassworks, was less dependent on slave-harvested southern cotton. America embraced the gospel of wealth and the golden rule for slave owners, industrialists, and financiers was survival of the fittest. Rich men like Cornelius Vanderbilt were replacing George Washington and Andrew Jackson as national heroes. Mutual aid societies and secret fraternal orders like Tammany Hall, the Oddfellows, Know-Nothings, and Masons were private clubs for the elite that became political machines that ultimately determined the future of the American economy and the country's leadership. Railroads, like the Pennsylvania, were the leading technology companies of the day, and they offered the quickest route for an ambitious white man of humble origins to advance in business, society, and politics. Abraham Lincoln, a self-taught attorney with only 18 months of formal schooling, put his law career on hold after he was elected to the U.S. Congress as a representative for the state of Illinois in 1846. When Lincoln's 2-year term in Congress ended at the beginning of the gold rush, he did not seek re-election. Lincoln returned to Illinois, where he re-established his private law practice by successfully representing the Illinois Central. Lincoln earned as much as $5,000 per case as a railroad employee and maintained a strong political alliance with them. On May 29, 1856, Abraham Lincoln condemned the expansion of slavery in a strongly worded speech during a convention of disgruntled Northern Democrats in Bloomington, Illinois. Lincoln's words were not recorded, but his impassioned speech led to the birth of the Illinois Republican Party and thrust him into the national spotlight. 7 weeks earlier, 700 miles away, an enslaved woman gave birth to a boy named Booker on a plantation in Virginia. Booker's plantation was miles from any railroad, large city, or daily newspaper, but the grapevine telegraph, which kept slaves informed, was soon buzzing about the man they called Lincoln.
I have never believed that actual disruption of the Union can occur without blood. And if, through the madness of Northern abolitionists, that dire calamity must come, the fighting will not be along Mason and Dixon's line merely. It'll be within our own borders, in our own streets. Former U.S. President Franklin Pierce, a letter to Jefferson Davis.
U.S. President Franklin Pierce, a Northern Democrat who believed the abolitionist movement was a fundamental threat to the unity of the nation, inflamed tensions between the northern and southern states by signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led to armed confrontation on the Missouri border and gave rise to John Brown. Franklin Pierce was such a polarizing figure, his party refused to nominate him for a second term. Democrats chose to run James Buchanan of Pennsylvania as their candidate for president in 1856. Buchanan had been overseas serving as minister to England when the violence erupted in Kansas and had voiced no strong public opinions on the matter. James Buchanan easily defeated the Republicans' first presidential nominee, the abolitionist, former military governor of California, John C. Fremont. Buchanan was an indecisive president who took orders from the Southern plantation elite. During the Dred Scott case, he gathered support in the Supreme Court for a pro-slavery decision and unsuccessfully tried to admit Kansas as a slave state. This angered both Republicans and Northern Democrats, and Buchanan wouldn't run for a second term. In May of 1860, the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate at the party's national convention in Chicago. Lincoln promised not to abolish slavery in the South, but he was seen as a threat to the slave power. his election gave slavocrats the excuse they needed. 7 months later, the state of South Carolina withdrew from the Union. The next year, it was followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Former U.S. War Secretary Jefferson Davis, who was viewed as a champion of slave society and the planter class, was elected president.
I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of State to affix the seal of the United States to a proclamation setting on foot a blockade of the ports of the states of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Dated this day and signed by me, and for so doing this shall be his warrant. Abraham Lincoln, Washington, April 19th, 1861.
After rebels captured Fort Sumter, President Lincoln responded by declaring war on the newly formed Confederate States of America. Most Northerners grossly underestimated the South's willingness to defend its right to own slaves. In the Confederate Army, slaves accompanied their owners or the master's son to the battlefield. Slaves provided non-combatant labor like cooking food, washing clothes, and building fortifications. Prominent free blacks in New Orleans formed the Louisiana Native Guard and pledged allegiance to the Confederacy. A trusted servant from North Carolina named Robert Smalls was assigned to pilot a Confederate steamer, but he and the slave crew sailed to freedom with their wives hidden below deck. General Thomas Stonewall Jackson defeated Union forces in the conflict's first major battle at Manassas. Jackson and his wife organized Sunday school classes for blacks in Virginia, where he was considered a good Christian slave owner who treated Negroes humanely. After a string of victories by Stonewall Jackson, in May of 1862, U.S. General David Hunter formed the first volunteer black regiment in South Carolina, then issued an order emancipating slaves in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida that the White House quickly overturned.
Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, a musket on his shoulder, bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny he has earned the right to citizenship. Frederick Douglass, April 1863.
Neither side wanted to arm blacks, but after a string of Confederate victories and a decline in white volunteers, the Union Army began recruiting Negroes. Out west, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Cherokee nations aligned with the southern states because Native American slave owners were afraid the North would confiscate their lands. In July 1862, over the concerns of slave states that remained loyal to the Union, like Maryland, Congress passed a Confiscation Act, which freed any slave whose owner was in rebellion against the United States. Fugitives who fled to Union camps were considered contraband and performed menial tasks for Union soldiers, just like slaves in the Confederate Army. The police in Cincinnati, Ohio, forced black male residents to construct forts at gunpoint. Ex-slaves like Harriet Tubman often served as scouts and spies. Most white military officers doubted blacks' ability as soldiers until the colored infantry of Kansas bravely fought off a Confederate guerrilla assault in Missouri. This led to the creation of more colored state regiments.
Whenever you may be called upon to measure arms or bayonets with the rebel horde, give no quarter, take no prisoners, make it dangerous to take the life of a black soldier. Then they will respect your manhood.
A proclamation by the President of the United States of America. On the first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever, free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any effort they may make for their actual freedom. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that, in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. President Abraham Lincoln, September 22nd, 1862.
The slaves were in the fields chopping the cotton and chanting the rhythm of the day as a testimony to the drowsy overseer that they were doing his bidding. Massa Ridley was on the porch of the big house fast asleep. The Yankees had ridden up to the mansion, and the horses put their hoofs on the low and unrailed porch as if at home. Dr. Ridley awakened quickly, surprised, startled, bewildered, perplexed, a riot of color. Some words passed between the parties, and then one of the soldiers took something out of his pocket and read it. By this time, Mrs. Ridley had come from the house. She too heard the story and saw her husband's eyes suffused with tears, but said not a word. Dr. Ridley was trying hard to keep the tears back. He summoned Miles and spoke slowly, with a tear in his voice. "Miles," he said, "call all the niggers together." Dr. Elijah John Fisher.
There it was. After almost 2.5 centuries, with a stroke of a pen, Abraham Lincoln freed every slave held in Confederate territory. When the plantation foreman blew his slave horn on Friday morning, January 1, 1863, thousands of servants rose for work and received the news from their master. It was the first time many of them had seen a white man cry. Some cried with him, others shouted with joy. Most slave owners, however, ignored Lincoln's order. Confederate President Jefferson Davis issued his own proclamation and promised to re-enslave any black fugitive bearing arms for the Union. Davis put a bounty on the head of U.S. General Benjamin Butler, who was the first Union officer to confiscate fugitive slaves for the Army. Butler had also placed New Orleans under martial law and ordered that any white woman who disrespected his soldiers be treated as a common prostitute.
My brave boys were full of hope and confident of victory as I led them forth. And though officers and men alike knew what was before them, knew the odds against them, they eagerly offered up their lives on the altar of duty, having absolute faith in their ultimate success. Oh, how faithfully they kept their word, following me unto the death. And I, believing in the promised support, led them on. Well, it is all over now. The battle is lost. Many of us are prisoners. Many are dead, many wounded, bleeding, and dying.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any other nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. Abraham Lincoln, November 19th, 1863.
Many of the Union Army soldiers were poor German and Irish immigrants who served as substitutes for wealthy Northern industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Poor white soldiers often resented fighting alongside former slaves, and white doctors were reluctant to provide care for colored regiments. When Congress instituted a draft, working-class white immigrants in New York City launched a protest and began attacking black people throughout the city. Northern troops freed slaves one plantation at a time, and Negroes eagerly enlisted. Blacks were given inferior weapons and died at a higher rate than white soldiers, and they were often the victims of war crimes. One black sergeant in South Carolina was court-martialed and put to death for mutiny after demanding equal pay. When General Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania, he seized Negroes at random and sold them into slavery. Confederates massacred 230 African American soldiers after Union forces surrendered at Fort Pillow in Tennessee. General Lee's rebels slaughtered over 400 black troops at the Battle of the Crater. When news spread that over 200 blacks in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry died charging Fort Wagner in South Carolina, volunteers increased.
His Excellency Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States. Mr. President, I beg leave to call your attention to the importance of immediate and vigorous measures to increase the strength of our armies. The necessity is now great and will soon be augmented by the results of the coming draft. As matters now stand, we have no troops disposable to meet the movements of the enemy or strike when opportunity presents. The enemy's position enables him to move his troops to the right or left without our knowledge until he has reached the point at which he aims, and we are then compelled to hurry our men to meet him, too late to check his progress. The means of obtaining men for field duty, as far as I can see, are only three. A considerable could be placed in the ranks by relieving all able-bodied white men employed as teamsters, cooks, mechanics, and laborers, and supplying their places with Negroes. I think measures should be taken at once to substitute Negroes for white in every place in the Army, or connected with it, where the former can be used. It seems to me that we must choose between employing Negroes ourselves or having them employed against us. With great respect, your obedient servant, Robert E. Lee.
Colored regiments fought bravely at the Battle of Olustee and were a deciding factor in the Union victory in Nashville. After intense fighting, Union regiments, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, subdued Tennessee and Mississippi with the help of Southern whites who were against secession. Black soldiers marched into the mountains of Virginia and the low swamps of South Carolina to liberate maroon communities.
An attacker advances against you, Nineveh. Guard the fortress. Watch the road. Brace yourselves. Marshal all your strength. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will burn up your chariots in smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will leave you no prey on the earth. The voices of your messengers will no longer be heard.
In November 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman burned the city of Atlanta to the ground and unleashed a reign of terror on his march to South Carolina, which broke the back of the Confederacy.
We have heard the loud booming of cannon all day. I have been left in my home with no one but my servant Sadie. We have cause to fear that we might be homeless, for on every side we see smoke rising from burning buildings and bridges. I saw such a stampede. The road was full of carriages, wagons, men on horseback, all riding at full speed. Judge Floyd stopped and said, "The Yankees are coming. They have got my family and all I have upon earth. Hide your mules and carriages and whatever valuables you have."
Behind us, we leave a track of smoke and flame. Half of Marietta was burned up. The command is to destroy all property which can be of use to the rebel armies. General Sherman distributed provisions to the Negroes with his own hands. He assured them that we were their friends, and they need not be afraid. Sherman invited all able-bodied Negroes to join the column, and he takes special pleasure when they join the procession. On some occasions, he tells them they are free. Massa Lincoln has given them their liberty, and they can go where they please.
Tens of thousands of black refugees joined Sherman's march to the sea, looking for protection. Ex-slaves cheered Sherman's troops on as they torched fields and reduced whole plantations to ashes. After meeting with local black ministers, General Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which confiscated 400,000 acres of land along the Atlantic coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The confiscated southern land was to be divided into 40-acre parcels and redistributed to former slaves, along with a mule. Union battalions launched an all-out attack on the state of Virginia in the spring of 1865. And on April 9th, hundreds of triumphant black troops were present when Robert E. Lee finally surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. When the white man's war was over, colored regiments were mustered out of service, and 13 African Americans received the Congressional Medal of Honor. Almost 200,000 blacks volunteered to serve the Union war effort as colored troops. About 1/3 of them lost their lives. Thousands of fugitive slaves had enlisted to relieve their condition and returned as more than conquerors. They were now free men. Emancipation presented the African American with a whole new set of challenges. Where would they live, and how would they support themselves? New discriminatory laws would be passed to hinder the advancement of colored people, and black Americans would meet the challenge head-on in dramatic fashion. That, however, is a different story for another time.